So it seems that we've got a Tyranid warrior battle line stomping its way into Warhammer 40k today. Let's take a look at the new rules and how strong they are for the all-devouring swarms. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Tyranids, and in this video we're delving into their Grotmas Advent Calendar detachment and seeing what goodness Games Workshop has in store for them. This is continuing Games Workshop's one detachment per day for December, all fully playable and match play immediately, with points cost for the enhancements written on them, so a bit of a massive glut of content for Warhammer 40k fans. So far we've had the Dark Angels and the Death Guard. The third detachment so far is for Tyranids, and apparently tomorrow we've got the Thousand Suns coming up. Having those two next to each other maybe feels like a bit of Space Marine 2 theming perhaps. As armies go in Warhammer 40k though, Tyranids are doing rather well currently around about 50% wins on the tournament scene, and in terms of detachments being viable, Games Workshop have done better with them than the majority of armies out there. 4 of their 6 detachments are seeing competitive play: Invasion Fleets, Vanguard Onslaught, Synaptic Nexus and Crusher Stampedes, though it is perhaps a bit of a shame about what they did to Unending Swarm. After a fair few balance revisions and that rather big rules drop that they had in summer this year, they're now at the point where the majority of their units are pretty viable, even if they still perhaps feel a little bit dependent on a few datasheets for their core damage dealing. Particularly the Exocrine and Tyrannifex tend to appear in a lot of lists. One unit that really hadn't been in the spotlight in 10th edition, even if they had their big heyday in 9th, were the Tyranid Warriors, which maybe did feel a bit weird given that they're one of the central units and the elite fighting force of the Tyranids, and it seems that Games Workshop agreed with that. I've decided to make them the focus of this detachment. As a result, the Tyranid detachment is a Warrior Bioform Onslaught. I feel like for the lore and theming of this one, it's kind of straightforward. They don't really talk about much in the lore of the detachment, aside from warriors being some of the most well-rounded bioforms, both dangerous in the fight and also capable of commanding lesser synaptic beasts, with the will of the hive mind flowing directly through them. I kind of feel like it doesn't really need all that much explanation though. They've often been troops in the past, and pretty much the units that you expect to have at the heart of the swarm. It doesn't really take much justification to have them be a central unit for the detachment, the Tyranids sending in their elites to crush the enemy opposition. With their prominence in Space Marine 2 as well, it is kind of nice to see a little bit more focus on them in Warhammer 40k. They're pretty much the primary enemy of the Tyranids there, but out of the Tyranids units they've generally been a little bit more on the niche side more recently. The melee version can certainly be usable, though they perhaps don't tend to be the mainstay unit of an army. And with that in mind, I thought we could take a look through the Tyranid warrior datasheets and then jump into the detachment. First up we have the ranged warriors. These guys are 65 points per 3 at the moment. They've got 3 wounds at toughness 5 with a 4+ save and OC 2. They're not really standout, easy to kill for the cost, but basically any weapon will be able to have good effect against them, whether it's small arms or heavy weapons firepower, and that's not always the best place to be in. These ones get shooting attacks, maybe with Death Spitters for 3 attacks at strength 5, AP 1, damage 1, a heavy hitting venom cannon per 3 of them, and then some claws in melee with strength 5, AP 1 and damage 1. They can fall back, shoot and charge as their unit ability. The melee warriors tend to be the ones that see more competitive play. They don't get any guns but get some seriously savage melee attacks. 6 attacks at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 1 with twin linked. Particularly when you've got a unit of say 6 of them throwing 36 of those attacks around, it's going to stack a fair few saves on pretty well anything. Ideally though, they don't really want to be fighting against toughness 10 things or higher, as they'll be wounding on 6s. They get inbuilt reroll 1s to hit or reroll 1s of saving throws as their unit rule. Finally, worth mentioning the Tyranid Prime to lead them. He's 65 points, gives the warriors sustained hits 1. That doesn't exactly have the most exceptional melee in himself. 6 attacks at strength 6, AP 1 and damage 2 is okay, but the AP 1 does let it down a bit there. He certainly can be useful in a melee warrior unit though, as he's got good movement characteristic to scout out the front of them. So potentially you could use his better movement to reduce their charge distance and get into combat with things that otherwise you might have struggled with. Getting into the detachment itself though, and the core rule is this Leader Beasts one. It's basically in 2 parts and does pretty well revolve around warriors. The core bit is that Tyranid warriors and the Winged Tyranid Prime units both get a 5+ invulnerable save. I'd say that is really quite helpful for them, given that one of their main weaknesses is being a bit too easy to kill. It's still not going to flip them into a standout durable unit, but it's going to reduce casualties and make a warrior unit need a fair bit more focus fire. I think that's quite helpful to have just passively on for the entire army all the time. It's good for the melee warriors that'll certainly be taking the brunt of the firepower, but at just 65 points I feel like it makes the ranged ones genuinely quite durable for the cost now. And weirdly enough, it also looks like it would apply to gargoyles led by the Prime, though it feels like you might want the Primes leading the warrior units in this detachment. Otherwise, beyond that, both types of warriors gain battle line. It was actually kind of surprising to me that they didn't have that at the start of 10th, as they've usually been troops previously. And it is nice that you can have basically as many of them as you want in this detachment. I feel like that's enough to be able to take more units than you'd really need in a balanced list. It means that you could do crazy things if you wanted, like 6 units of 6 melee warriors for 900 points, and maxed out warrior spam I believe is just under 1700 points for 72 warriors on the board. Again, almost certainly overkill, but at least you know that the cap on units probably isn't going to be the biggest deal here. Finally, warriors get OC3. They normally have OC2, so that gives them a fair bit more weight on objectives. Even a squad of 3 of them has OC9 now, which is fairly chunky, and that feels like a solid further help to making them viable as the mainstay of the list, as they're going to be able to grab those objectives pretty well while they're scrapping over them. The detachment also hands out the Tyranid warrior keyword to the 2 types of warriors, which didn't originally have just a single unifying one, and that stops them having to write out the full name for both units all the time. Overall, as it goes, it feels like a simple and helpful core rule. Extra toughness and extra objective control. Both good things, but maybe not quite so stand out that it's going to add crazy amounts of power versus the other Tyranid ones. I feel like maybe a little bit more of the power of this detachment is slanted towards the stratagems and things. Starting out through those, and first up we have Synaptic Amplification. This one allows you to reroll wound rolls of 1 when shooting or fighting, and that can be used on any Tyranid's unit. If you're a warrior unit, then you also get to reroll hit rolls of 1. And also, if you do happen to use it on a Tyranid warrior unit, then if there's an Endless Multitude unit within 6 inches, one of those units can be given reroll wound rolls of 1 as well. I feel like in theory this one should be a good stratagem, but is limited by the unit. The base version just isn't really all that impressive on most Tyranid units. Reroll wound rolls of 1 equates to plus 17% damage, and that's just usually not enough to be justifying on any one unit. I guess maybe might just about get there on units of Zoanthropes with a Neurotyrant perhaps. It does seem like it's going to be best on warriors, but it's kind of annoying it in the profile just doesn't really work for the melee warriors. They already get 2 reroll wound rolls with their twin linked profile, and they can also opt to take reroll 1s to hit with their melee profile as well. So kind of completely redundant on them. It really feels like it's going to be most focused around ranged warriors, which don't really tend to have the most crazy damage profiles in the world. And it's also kind of annoying for them, as their damage is fairly equally split between range and melee, and this will only be buffing one phase of their attacks. Overall, as a result, it feels a bit situational to me, rather than something that you go around building to use, but being able to turn on some extra damage in a couple of different ways could be helpful if it's really a make or break combat where literally every bit of damage is going to count. Next up, we've got Spontaneous Hypercorrosion, which I think is quite a lot more interesting. You get plus 2 strength to ranged weapons for any Tyranid unit this phase, or you can get a plus 1 strength to warrior or prime melee weapons when they're fighting in close. Both of those bits could be potentially very useful. If it makes a plus 1 to wound boost, that's going to be usually a lot more powerful than Synaptic Amplification. Focusing on the warriors, that'll mean that you could get the melee warriors up to strength 6, which is quite a big breakpoint. With their twin links, that'll mean that you'd be wounding toughness 10 and toughness 11 5 out of 9 times. That's going to make the difference between scratching a few wounds off a tank and potentially having the chance to one round certain things like maybe predators, and could be good against toughness 6 units as well. I say most big range things aren't going to care too much enough to get the big value out of that. I feel like on paper maybe one of the single most powerful could be the very popular Exocrine. Say if that's taking aim at a toughness 10 vehicle, you'd go from wounding that on a 5 to wounding that on a 3, which is kind of huge. That'd feel really quite justifiable there. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Tabletop Stronghold, one option for some custom built magnetic carry cases made in the USA. Magnetic storage is pretty popular with 40k armies these days, the idea being that you attach magnets to the bottom of your bases and then they can all be ranked up like this in a case, loads of models stored in a small space without rattling around or breaking on each other. They've currently still got their Black Friday sales going, and apparently they're going to keep those going for one more week, the deal's remaining until the 7th of December. Tabletop Stronghold specific magnetic cases are these mag case ones. The case is made of MDF, which is genuinely quite sturdy and hard to break once it's put together. And the trays inside are made of steel, able to be slotted at different levels for different miniature heights. They've also got a nice acrylic sheet on the front as well, so you can see the miniatures while they're being stored, which does feel like a positive. Broadly speaking, I've seen people on Reddit and in the comments and things generally quite positive if they did wind up picking one of these up. Obviously there's loads of options for model storage out there, but this one's quite a nice custom built solution. In any case, there'll be links down in the video description. I'll cycle back to a couple of their specific cases at the end of the video. On with the Tyranid goodness though, and next up we have a Restorative Impulse. You use this for one command point in the command phase to restore a destroyed model to your warrior units, and overall that feels like at least fairly good value. If you're using that on a melee warrior squad that's taken a casualty, you're immediately gaining 25 points back on the board, which certainly doesn't hurt, but perhaps equally or more impactful than that, you could also put an extra OC3 model down on an objective just before you come to score it, and if that tips an objective to your control, that could be massive. And also you could put that model ranging out the front of the squad a little bit, so that when you come to charge something later in the turn, the charge is shortened by 2 inches plus the model's base. That could be really quite a big deal if you don't have a unit that's led by anything, potentially extending their threat range to other things that they couldn't otherwise safely charge. Definitely seems like a solid option, though a little bit situational, as your opponents have to chip some damage from a unit but not destroy it. Next up, for 1 command point, there's Synaptic Micronodes. This one's a sticky objectives ability for warriors once more. You trigger it in the movement phase, and it's removed if the opponent controls it at the end of any phase. Being able to use it in the movement phase gives you a bit more flexibility. You could have an objective that was held by a different unit, and then the warriors move up to sticky it perhaps, and often the rule gets triggered in the command phase instead. It is a bit easier for the opponent to take you off the objective though, as usually that triggers at the start or end of any turn. This time it's any phase, so they could potentially remove the rule by just briefly overwhelming you by charging you, even if you wound up wiping them out. Next up, we've got Parasitic Payload, a removing cover option. A ranged warrior unit shooting gets to ignore cover for their own attacks, and also one enemy unit targeted can't gain the benefit of cover for the rest of the phase either. I feel like this one's probably going to be a bit borderline on the warrior shooting themselves, a couple of venom cannons and a few death bitters or something. Probably isn't going to be worth enough to have 1 command point to make cover go away for. So I think you'd more want to use this as a debuffing rule to be able to hand that out before you try and focus fire on something that's got a very high save and cover. Perhaps if you're about to light up a whole bunch of 2+ save infantry with some exocrines, or do the same for some Land Raider equivalents with Tyrannifexes or Zoanthropes, it feels like an okay option, though I feel like it only just about limps into being good enough in some situations, as opposed to being standout strong. Finally, for 1 command point, the last one's quite a nice one. Synaptic Shield gives you a -1 to wound against enemy shooting that has strength higher than your toughness, again for Tyranid warriors. And again, this one can be used for some endless multitudes nearby as well. If you have a unit of them within 6 inches of the unit targeted that aren't battle shocked, they can also have that -1 to wound debuff. That does seem fairly strong as a very nice reactive durability option against the right kind of firepower. It might equate to something like an extra 25 to 33% durability for the unit. Not too bad in addition to the 5+ invulnerable save that they get. It still maybe doesn't feel quite on the same sort of level as the 5+ feel no pain that you can pick up from Invasion Fleet perhaps, but still quite nice to keep the warriors alive and kicking. Overall though, I do feel like there's quite a few fun options with this one. I quite like the Revive a Warrior stratagem because that can have some shenanigans and some added solid value. Sticky objectives generally tends to be pretty useful. The +1 strength one seems good for both certain range and certain melee attacks, and -1 to wounds as reactive durability is rather nice, even if it is only at range and not in close combat. Finally we get to the enhancements. First up we have Synaptic Tyrant for 10 points. This one allows a Neurotyrant to be attached to a warrior squad. That one seems genuinely quite fun, given that Neurotyrants are just fairly efficient in their own right, as they buff Shadow in the Warp, plus provide Synapse, plus have some okay damage and defensive stats with that fun torrent attack. If you have one leading a warrior squad, then they get +1 to hit, plus the extra shooting, and then they can also have a +1 to wound as well against battle shocked things, which you might be able to get through Shadow of the Warp or perhaps a Neurolictor. On top of that, like the Zoanthropes, it also grants big guns never tire to ranged warriors, and that seems pretty nice given that they'd be able to claw away with their melee attacks and then also shoot the opponent in the face if they wound up in a protracted combat. Seems like him with a maxed out squad of ranged warriors could be quite a fun threat, though I guess he'd have to weigh up against the more common Zoanthropes he might want to run with. For 20 points, there's Ocular Adaptation. This one gives you a Winged Prime at +1 to hit for his lead unit. That means that his squad will both get sustained hits 1 and also be hitting on a 2+ in melee. So for a Tyranid warrior melee squad, that'll mean that you'd get slightly more hits than you have attacks on average, given that they reroll 1s to hit in melee via their own datasheet rule. Potentially that could be over 36 hits at AP2, or with strength 5 or 6, depending on the stratagem and twin linked. Even with damage 1, that's going to have a good chance to one round a whole bunch of stuff out there. With all of that maxed out, you do around about an average chance to one round something like a Lehman Russ, which is usually out of their reach, though it probably still only gets reliable if you've softened it up a tiny bit with shooting first. Next up, we've got Sensory Assimilation, which is 20 points. That one's a -1 to hit for their lead unit, so another handy durability boost there. That means that you've got a warrior squad that's got a 5+ invulnerable and -1 to hit all the time, and could flex into a -1 to wound against shooting. Overall, that seems like quite a nice unit for jumping onto a mid-board objective and then taking the brunt of the enemy firepower and damage. Again, seems nicely enough worth the points. And then finally we've got a very expensive 30 points for Elevated Might. This one grants advance and charge for the bearer's unit, and interestingly it does seem to be about the only thing that gives you extra mobility to try and get the warriors into the fight, aside from things like the command point resurrection shenanigans, and perhaps does feel like a fairly important enhancement as a result. I feel like the warriors do have enough melee damage to be pretty meaningful against the majority of targets, particularly with that +1 strength stratagem that they can take. The main issue might be getting them there, as they want to charge out from behind terrain, and this would quite greatly increase their threat range, particularly with the option for the prime to range out slightly in front of their units to shorten charges. It is a big 30 points, but I feel like that could still be worth it, for making sure that at least one of your melee blocks has some extended threat range and a good chance to hit a bunch of stuff that moves up into the midboard. You could use this one with others as well. This one isn't winged prime locked like the previous two. I guess you could have Hive Tyrants or a Brood Lord with Gene Stealers advancing and charging. In this detachment though, with the big focus on the warriors, it does feel like the prime could be the obvious choice. Overall for this one, I do think it's interesting. It's quite nice that it does directly make the warriors a bit tougher with the 5+ invulnerable saves, the reactive -1 to wound stratagem, and perhaps one prime's unit having a -1 to hit as well, plus the potential to heal warriors for a command point if it makes sense. Otherwise, for stronger advantages, the +1 strength in melee seems like it's really nice against the right target, or indeed exocrines against toughness 10. OC3 feels like a big deal for scrapping over objectives, and being able to access sticky objectives is a nice bonus as well. And the other enhancements both seem nice enough, with +1 to hit, advance and charge, and Neurotyrants plus warriors all seeming like they're really quite usable. I guess the question is whether or not it's going to be enough to make a warrior-centric Tyranid list something that you'd actually want to do again. It seems that for supporting the warrior datasheet itself, the main competition is probably invasion fleets. They've got options for big damage boosts on critical hits, reactive 5+ feel no pain, potentially fighting on death, so it's not like they don't get some big boost there. I would say that probably does a little bit less for them passively compared with this. To me it seems that if you want to go fairly warrior heavy and take quite a lot of them, then this detachment probably is better than that. But the trade-off is that compared with invasion fleets, that just gives you very general purpose support to a whole bunch of Tyranid units. So if you're taking a bit more of a mixed list, then the extra sustained or lethals and other options for feel no pain on things might well outweigh that. So as a result, I feel like you would want to go pretty solidly warrior heavy with this to outweigh the loss of utility on the other Tyranid units that you're still probably going to want. As mentioned, you could run a massive amount of them if you really wanted to. In theory land, you could max them out at 72 of them for just under 1700 points, at +3 winged primes and then some enhancements to get you most of the way up to 2k. I guess that'd be a lot of 1 damage profile to chew through, and you wouldn't really be able to ignore the melee prowess of the melee warrior squads, though in reality it's definitely far overkill, and to make more sense to take a more limited number plus some support. I still think that the warriors are likely going to want to have things that can either handle or weaken big multi-wound targets, things like some supporting fire from exocrines, tyrannofexes, maybe neurotyrants and zone throbes if they're not leading warriors, just to be able to really put a bunch of damage on things where the damaged one warrior attacks aren't going to cut it so much. Overall though, I think it feels like a good detachment, definitely trying to push Tyranid armies in a very different way to before. Nice to have a good reason to put mass warriors on the table if that's what you'd like to do. I wouldn't be too surprised if this had at least a little bit of competitive success. I don't know whether or not it's actually going to rival the other detachments for sheer power and utility yet though. Though if it doesn't, it's nice to have somewhere where Games Workshop could make rules adjustments to try and make warriors genuinely good for Tyranids. Let me know your thoughts though, I'll be interested to hear your takes on the detachments down in the comments. That's the end of the video, but for those interested, I'll cycle back to talk through a couple of their case options in Tabletop Stronghold, who as mentioned have their Black Friday deals on at the moment for a few more days. As mentioned earlier, they do magnetic carry cases where you can fit a bunch of models on each tray and then rank them up inside a MDF box, and you can fit a bunch of models on each plate as you can see here, like 90 smaller infantry or 30 Terminators or so and maximally loaded. For their sizes of box, they've got this mini one, which is £65, $70 or €88 in the sales. Those numbers are exclusive of VAT and sales tax or import duties though, which might vary per country, so bear that in mind if ordering. Those shipping costs are completely free and included in the cost. The mini one could be good for skirmish games, somewhere between 500 to 1000 points. Their more standard offering is this big mag case. This one's £107 or $115. It should be able to support a good number of fairly big army lists there. You can see the great big Chaos Knight on just the bottom floor of that to show that it is quite a big box. I'll leave the dimensions on screen. They all come with magnets to mount on the bases of the models as well. Finally, there's the really big one, essentially 2 of the previous attached together. This one's getting to the point where you could transport entire collections in it potentially. You can see a great big Baneblade on the top left there. and it also shows off the clear acrylic panels on the front, so you can see the models as they're being transported about. In any case, a big thanks to them for sponsoring this one, and feel free to check them out, linked in the video description. In any case though, I'll leave this one there for now. I'll be looking forward to covering the next one for the Thousand Suns tomorrow. Let me know your hopes and thoughts for that, and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more 40k talk in general. Check out all the bits in the video description, including the Patreon page if you'd like to support, or the channel's affiliate discount links if you're thinking about picking up any models in the near future. But in any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.